There are certain objects in life we keep for reasons we can't fully explain, things the world calls useless, outdated, or downright embarrassing. But what if the one item people told you to throw away was quietly holding the biggest turning point of your entire existence? That question had never crossed Sarah Mitchell's mind, not even once, as she sat alone in her nearly empty studio apartment, surrounded by moving boxes she couldn't afford to fill. The apartment smelled like defeat and instant coffee, the kind you buy when every dollar matters. 29 years of living, and this was what she had to show for it. Three garbage bags filled with worn out clothes, a futon that had collapsed in the middle like it had given up trying to support her, and the one thing everyone in her life insisted she should have abandoned years ago, her grandmother's dresser. The dresser stood against the far wall like a stubborn witness, all dark wood and tarnished brass, its carved floral details dulled by time and fingerprints of generations before her. It didn't match the apartment. It didn't match her life, and it didn't match her constant attempts to pretend she wasn't drowning in bills and disappointment. Yet it was the only thing that had followed her from place to place, eviction to eviction, heartbreak to heartbreak. While everything else slipped through her fingers, the dresser remained, heavy and inconvenient and full of memories that refused to leave her alone. Everyone mocked her for keeping it. Her ex-husband called it deadweight. Her mother hated how old-fashioned it looked. Her sister Jessica, who lived in a condo that smelled like wealth and eucalyptus candles, once offered to pay for a dumpster just to get rid of it. Even her landlord's son, Kevin, whose biggest accomplishment was managing to smirk while delivering past due notices, had suggested that selling the dresser might finally help her pay rent on time. Vintage stores take junk like that, he'd told her with the confidence of someone who'd never worked a double shift to afford groceries. But Sarah kept it anyway, even when she couldn't find the words to explain why. Maybe because it was the last piece of her grandmother she still had. Maybe because it made her feel rooted in a life that kept pulling itself apart. Or maybe because, in a world constantly slipping out of her control, the dresser stayed exactly where she put it. But emotional loyalty didn't pay rent, and the pounding in her chest reminded her that she had exactly 3 days before everything she owned would end up on the street again. Her phone buzzed on the floor beside her, but she didn't need to look to know what it was. Another message from the landlord, another countdown. Another reminder that no matter how hard she worked, the math never favored her. 2 jobs, 14-hour days, aching feet, and still she came up short every single month. Rent, utilities, food, transportation. The numbers mocked her just as loudly as the people who told her she wasn't trying hard enough. She rubbed her face with both hands, exhaustion settling into her bones, and for the first time she wondered if Jessica had been right all along. Maybe she should let the dresser go. Maybe it was time to stop clinging to something that had no logical place in her life anymore. But even as the thought formed, something inside her recoiled. Let go of the one thing that had stayed with her through everything. Let go of the thing her grandmother had given her with eyes full of quiet knowing. She couldn't. Even if it made no sense, she couldn't. Still, reality didn't care about sentiment. A sharp knock echoed through the room, loud enough to jolt her off the floor. She knew immediately who it was. There was a particular rhythm to Kevin's knock, impatient, entitled, a little too eager. He didn't bother hiding his delight when people struggled. She cracked the door open, and there he stood, arms folded, smirk ready. His words were predictable, his judgment even more so. And when his eyes flicked past her to the dresser, lingering with disdain, Sarah felt something hot rise inside her. He called it junk. He always called it junk, and yet he had no idea what it actually meant to her. The moment he walked away, she pressed her back against the door and let out a breath that felt heavier than her entire apartment. She refused to cry. Crying never solved anything. Crying never stopped bills from piling up or landlords from losing patience. Crying never brought back the life she thought she'd have by now. But something else stirred beneath her frustration, a faint, almost imperceptible pull. A whisper of a question she had never allowed herself to ask. Why had she really kept the dresser? Why did its presence feel more meaningful than logic should allow? Why did it feel like letting it go would be letting go of something far bigger than furniture? This wasn't just stubbornness. This wasn't just sentimentality. Something in her gut insisted she hold on, insisted she look closer, insisted that the thing everyone mocked might not be what it seemed. But she shook the thought away. Magical thinking wasn't going to save her. Nothing ever did, and yet the dresser seemed to be waiting. Her eyes drifted back toward it, the carved flowers catching the dim light like they were trying to tell her something she didn't know how to hear. For the first time, she wondered if her grandmother had kept secrets. Real secrets, life-changing secrets. Sarah had never asked, she'd never thought to, but the question lingered anyway, unsettling and persistent. What if the one thing she'd been dragging from apartment to apartment wasn't a burden at all? What if it was the key to everything her life had been missing? She didn't know it yet, but she was only one pull of a drawer away from an answer that would shatter everything she believed about her past and everything she thought she knew about her future. Because in just a moment, Sarah would open a drawer that wasn't supposed to move, and nothing in her life would ever look the same again. There are moments in life that seem insignificant at first, quiet, almost forgettable glimpses of time that slip by unnoticed. Yet sometimes, those moments contain the first crack in a wall you never realized was hiding something behind it. Sarah didn't know it yet, but she was standing at the edge of such a moment as she stared at the dresser everyone mocked her for keeping. She had always seen it as a relic of the past, a reminder of a woman who believed in her when no one else did. But now, under the weight of eviction notices and exhaustion, the dresser felt less like a sentimental heirloom and more like a question she'd never bothered to ask. Why had her grandmother insisted she keep it? Why had she clung to it with a protectiveness that didn't match its appearance or value or lack thereof? That thought lingered in the quiet of her studio as she moved toward the dresser, almost without consciously deciding to. It wasn't curiosity that pulled her forward at first, just desperation mixed with a faint, irrational hope. She needed money, she needed a miracle, and miracles weren't going to show up in the form of 3 trash bags and a sagging futon. If she was being realistic, the dresser was the only object she owned that might fetch anything even remotely useful, even if it was just enough to buy her a little more time. But when she placed her hand on its surface, something unexpected happened. The wood felt different, not in texture, but in weight, as if the piece was holding its breath, waiting for her to do something she'd avoided for years. She pulled open the top drawer, not expecting anything except the usual worn fabric and scrap memories. She found old shirts, faded photos, a cheap jewelry box with tangled necklaces, nothing worth more than sentiment, nothing that would impress a pawn shop. Still, she kept digging, driven by something she couldn't articulate. As she moved to the second drawer, then the third, a strange tension built within her, a quiet hum of intuition she hadn't felt in years. Maybe it was only exhaustion. Maybe it was survival instincts clawing at any possibility. Or maybe it was something deeper, something her grandmother had planted long before Sarah understood she'd need it. The third drawer stuck, just as it always had. For years she had jiggled it a certain way to coax it open, a small, everyday struggle she'd never questioned. But today the resistance was different. There was a subtle shift beneath her fingers, a muted sound she'd never heard before, like a click, faint but deliberate. Her breath caught, drawers didn't just click, not like that, not after 13 years of behaving normally. She pulled again, slower this time, feeling every millimeter of movement. The wood groaned softly, resisting her in a way that didn't feel like age. It felt purposeful, like the drawer didn't want to reveal what was behind it unless she insisted. A formed quietly inside her mind as adrenaline replaced her fatigue. Why would a drawer make a sound like that? Why today? What had changed? The questions stacked themselves faster than she could answer them. She forced the drawer open and stared into it, expecting, hoping for something obvious. But the drawer was as unimpressive as ever. A few worn shirts, a stray button, tissue paper wrinkled from years of being rearranged. Nothing unusual, nothing of value, but her instincts wouldn't let it go. Something was wrong, something was different. She pressed her hand along the bottom of the drawer, fingers sweeping over the wood. And then there it was, an uneven dip beneath her fingertips, a slight give in the wood as if a panel wasn't properly secured. She pressed again, harder, another click. This time the sound was unmistakable. Her mind raced. She had lived with this dresser for more than a decade. She'd loaded it, emptied it, moved it across the city multiple times. She had argued with movers about its weight, defended it from her sister's insults, even slept on the floor beside it during nights when she couldn't afford a bed. Never once had she heard anything like that. Her heart began to hammer as she removed the drawer entirely and placed it on the floor. She crouched down, shining her phone flashlight into the cavity. The interior was darker than she expected, the shadows swallowing most of the space. But then she noticed it, the faintest outline where 2 pieces of wood didn't quite match. A thin seam, perfectly straight, too precise to be accidental. Her pulse surged as she traced the seam, and her fingers landed on a tiny brass mechanism barely visible to the naked eye. Who would ever notice such a thing? Who would think to look? Only someone who kept a dresser long after its usefulness, long after everyone told her to throw it away. She pressed the brass catch. The bottom of the drawer lifted ever so slightly, as if exhaling after years of silence. A hidden compartment, a secret space built into a piece of furniture everyone believed was worthless. Amid slammed into her thoughts, what kind of grandmother hides something in a dresser like this, and why had she never told Sarah about it? Her breathing grew shallow as she lifted the false bottom with trembling hands. Beneath it was a packet wrapped in old tissue paper, pristine compared to the worn exterior of the dresser itself. The bundle had weight not heavy enough to be metal, not soft enough to be clothes. Something important, something intentional, something hidden. Sarah froze, her mind spiraling between fear and hope, between disbelief and possibility. 1,000 questions flared at once, none of them with answers. Her grandmother had never been mysterious. She had been warm, gentle, steady, yet here was a secret compartment carved into her dresser. What else had she never said? What else had she never shown? Sarah's fingers hovered above the wrapped object, her hands shaking. She knew instinctively that whatever lay inside would change everything. Maybe not fix everything, but change something big enough to matter in a life where nothing ever seemed to go her way. She lifted the bundle, and for the first time in years, she felt a flicker of something she had almost forgotten how to feel: possibility. Because inside that hidden compartment was not just a packet, but a truth so massive it would leave Sarah questioning everything she thought she knew about her grandmother's life and her own. There are discoveries that feel like thunder, sudden, explosive, impossible to ignore. And then there are discoveries that creep into your life quietly, the way a sunrise slips into a room before you even realize morning has arrived. The object in Sarah's trembling hands felt like both at once. The bundle was small, no larger than a clutch purse, but its weight carried the same unsettling gravity as a locked door in an abandoned house. Something was inside, something her grandmother had intentionally hidden, wrapped, and buried beneath a false drawer. But what kind of person hides something for decades and says nothing about it? What kind of secret needed to stay buried until now? That question burned hotter than fear as she sat cross-legged on the floor, the hidden bundle resting across her lap like it held the answer to everything she'd never understood. Her heart thudded against her ribs as she peeled back the first layer of tissue paper. The crispness of the folds suggested it hadn't been touched in years, decades maybe. A strange shiver crawled up her spine as she unfolded the final layer, revealing a leather folio, deep brown, worn at the edges, the kind of thing someone with careful habits would tuck away for safekeeping. Sarah hesitated, not because she wanted to savor the moment, but because some part of her suddenly wondered if she even had the right to open it. What if it wasn't meant for her? What if it was something private, emotionally private, not monetarily significant? But then again, her grandmother had placed it inside this dresser, the only object she'd begged Sarah never to leave behind. That wasn't an accident. That wasn't coincidence. That was purpose. That was instruction without words. Still, her hands shook as she unfastened the small leather strap and opened the folio. The first thing she saw didn't make sense. They were papers, not letters, not diaries, not sentimental keepsakes. These were official documents, crisp and carefully aligned. Certificates, printed sheets with company logos she recognized but couldn't quite process in this context. Apple, Amazon, Microsoft. Names she'd seen on billboards, on customers' devices at the diner, on advertisements she passed while riding the bus. But what were they doing here? Why would her grandmother, a woman who'd never once owned a smartphone, have anything to do with tech companies worth billions? Her confusion deepened as she thumbed through the stack. The certificates were old, printed in fonts that screamed of earlier decades. Dates from the late 80s, early 90s. Purchase quantities that looked absurdly low until she realized the price per share was laughable by modern standards. Her mind tried to make sense of it. Was this some kind of promotional paperwork, something her grandmother picked up at a flea market, something outdated and useless? But then she saw the embossed seals, the signatures, the original issue stamps. These weren't replicas, these weren't novelties. These were actual stock certificates. A sharp midhook snapped into her thoughts. What if these papers weren't worthless at all? What if they were worth more than every paycheck she'd ever earned in her life combined? Her breath hitched as she grabbed her phone, hands fumbling over the screen. She opened a browser and typed, her fingers barely obeying her. Apple stock value today. The number that appeared made her vision blur. She whispered a shaky no, followed by an even shakier, that can't be right. Apple alone was enormous, far beyond anything she had ever imagined holding in her hands. Her hands trembled harder as she typed the next query. Amazon stock value today. The number that appeared didn't just blur her vision, it shattered her understanding of what she was even looking at. Amazon had exploded in value since its early days. Even a tiny amount purchased decades ago would be life-changing now. She forced herself to breathe and looked at Microsoft next. The number was lower than the others, but still astronomical compared to her entire net worth, her entire life's earnings. Her heart raced uncontrollably. She blinked at the documents, then at the search results, then back at the folio. Was this possible? No, more than that. Was this real? She flipped the certificates over, searching for something that would debunk the miracle forming in her mind. But everything looked legitimate. The seals, the print, the dates, her grandmother's faint handwriting on the back of some pages, notes she'd never noticed, in a script she instantly recognized from birthday cards long archived in shoeboxes. She felt a dizzy wave crash through her as she spread the papers across the floor, arranging them in neat rows. Her entire life had been ruled by scarcity, trying to stretch paychecks that ripped apart before the month even began. She had worked herself to exhaustion for jobs that barely kept her afloat, and this whole time, this entire time, she had slept in rooms too small to hold her dreams, next to a dresser holding enough wealth to rewrite the course of her existence. Her chest tightened, emotions colliding: disbelief, joy, shock, guilt, grief. Why hadn't her grandmother told her? Why keep this hidden? Why let her live through years of financial suffering? Why give her the dresser but hide the truth inside it? Had her grandmother believed Sarah wouldn't be ready? Had she been protecting Sarah from family greed? Or had she trusted that Sarah would one day be forced by life, by desperation, to look deeper? She didn't know the answer. She just knew one thing with absolute certainty now. Her grandmother had not been careless or whimsical. She had been intentional, deliberate, leaving behind something that carried unimaginable weight. But Sarah wasn't used to miracles. Her mind kept waiting for the catch, the flaw, the misunderstanding that would yank the rug back out from under her. The certificates looked real, but she needed confirmation. She needed someone who knew more than Google results, someone who could verify whether she was holding a bag of outdated papers or the financial equivalent of lightning in her hands. Her pulse hammered as she gathered the folio, clutching it against her chest. She didn't know it yet, but her grandmother's secrets didn't end with the stock certificates, not even close. The truth behind her grandmother's quiet life, behind the dresser everyone mocked, was far deeper, far more intentional, and far more life-altering than Sarah had even begun to imagine. Because hidden among those certificates was something even more shocking, a letter that would reveal her grandmother's true intentions and the reason Sarah was chosen all along. There are revelations that change your finances, and then there are revelations that change you. The documents Sarah found inside the hidden compartment were overwhelming enough: stocks worth more than anything she'd ever dreamed of owning, investments that shouldn't have existed in her grandmother's simple, ordinary life. But nothing prepared her for what lay tucked beneath those certificates, folded so carefully it felt almost sacred. A letter, her name written on the front in handwriting so familiar it felt like a hand reaching across time, steady even after years of absence. It was as if her grandmother had known exactly when Sarah would open this drawer, exactly when she'd be desperate enough, tired enough, lost enough to finally discover the truth. That thought alone sent a prickle of electricity through her spine. She hesitated for a long moment before opening it, afraid that whatever the letter contained would unravel the world she thought she understood. But curiosity, the same stubborn force that had pushed her to lift the false drawer bottom, rippled through her. Why had her grandmother hidden stock certificates worth millions? Why had she never spoken of them? Why place them inside the one object everyone insisted Sarah discard? Questions swarmed her mind faster than she could sort them, each one carrying its own emotional punch. Who exactly had her grandmother been, and how much of her life had Sarah never been allowed to see? The envelope's glue cracked softly, and with it came the first hook of the truth waiting inside. The letter unfolded in her hands like a page from a life she suddenly realized she'd never fully understood. Her grandmother had always been warm, gentle, and unwaveringly patient, but not once had she ever seemed wealthy. Not once had she mentioned investing. Not once had she shown any sign of the lavish fortune now sitting on Sarah's floor. Yet the first lines of the letter revealed something astonishing. Her grandmother had been planning for Sarah's future since before Sarah even existed. The words were simple but heavy, written with the unmistakable softness of someone who loved fiercely and quietly. Her grandmother explained that the investments began decades earlier, during a time when the world saw technology as a gamble rather than a guarantee. Sarah's grandfather, whom she barely remembered, had taken an interest in companies no one believed in yet. After he passed unexpectedly, her grandmother continued investing in his memory, not knowing what the future held but believing in the promise of innovation. She didn't understand tech, she never claimed to, but she understood perseverance. She understood growth, she understood what it meant to plant something that wouldn't bloom for many years. A mid-hook pulled at Sarah as she realized something deeper. Her grandmother had kept all of this hidden deliberately. not out of selfishness, but out of protection. The letter explained that her grandmother had watched the family long enough to know who could handle responsibility and who would misuse it. She had seen greed in certain faces, entitlement in others. But in Sarah, she saw resilience, a resilience forged not from privilege, but from every hardship Sarah had survived alone. As Sarah read further, tears blurred her vision. Her grandmother wrote about seeing her struggle through childhood, through adolescence, through the years where Sarah felt like nothing she did was ever enough. The letter admitted something that shattered Sarah's breath. Her grandmother knew that Sarah's life would be harder than her siblings. She knew certain people in the family favored convenience, money, and appearances, things Sarah didn't have, didn't chase, and didn't pretend were important. Her grandmother had watched her endure heartbreak, financial instability, abandonment, and disappointment that weren't her fault. She had watched her cling to dignity even when the world stripped everything else away. And so, she wrote, the dresser was not just a piece of old furniture. It was a test of loyalty, a test of faith, a safeguard. The dresser was intentionally unattractive to everyone except Sarah, because only Sarah held the emotional connection strong enough to keep it. Her grandmother knew that if she told the truth, others would demand control of the fortune. They would manipulate, they would deceive. But if she hid the truth inside something only Sarah valued, then fate would guide the discovery at exactly the right time. Another midhook burned inside Sarah's chest as she read the next revelation. She was not simply meant to inherit money, she was meant to carry forward a legacy. Her grandmother had written that money itself didn't change people, money revealed them. And Sarah, unlike the rest, had lived her entire life proving she valued relationships over wealth and effort over shortcuts. She had worked hard not because she enjoyed struggle, but because she believed she didn't deserve better. Her grandmother wanted the money to do more than lift her out of poverty. She wanted it to lift the weight of shame Sarah had carried for far too long. But the letter didn't end there. Its final paragraphs left Sarah trembling. Her grandmother had prepared more than what was in the hidden compartment. There were additional documents, legal instructions, trust structures, and most shockingly, an attorney who had been holding sealed information for Sarah for years, information that could only be released once Sarah found what was hidden in the dresser. Her grandmother had planned everything meticulously, creating a timeline even death couldn't interrupt. She had built a system that trusted Sarah's intuition more than the family's opinions. Sarah lowered the letter slowly, overwhelmed by a tidal wave of emotions. Love, grief, disbelief, gratitude, all swirling together in a way that made it hard to breathe. She had spent years believing she was unlucky, unremarkable, unseen. She had believed life was something that happened to her, not something she could ever shape. But this letter, the truth in her hands, rewrote that narrative entirely. Her grandmother had seen her, truly seen her, and she had believed in Sarah's future so fiercely that she'd built an empire in silence just to protect it. Her hands trembling, she refolded the letter, holding it to her chest as if it could anchor her to something real. The room spun with possibilities. If the letter was true, if the stocks were real, then everything she had assumed about her life was wrong. And if there was a lawyer involved, one who had been waiting for her, then the real journey hadn't even started yet. Because the next morning, Sarah would walk into a lawyer's office expecting confirmation, and walk out realizing her grandmother's secret fortune wasn't just large, it was far beyond anything she had discovered so far. There are mornings when life feels predictable, even in its hardships. And then there are mornings when the universe tilts, just slightly, nudging you toward a truth you never knew was meant for you. Sarah woke up with the letter still pressed under her pillow, as if the words might slip away if she didn't physically hold on to them. The dresser, once a burden, once a joke to everyone, now felt like a doorway to a world she wasn't sure she was ready to step into. But readiness no longer mattered. What was hidden inside that dresser had already changed everything. And the letter's final line, a name, an address, a quiet instruction kept echoing through her: when you find this, go to him. He will explain the rest. Who was this attorney? Why had her grandmother trusted him with a secret so enormous? And what did the rest even mean when she was already staring at millions of dollars in old stock certificates? The questions gnawed at her, refusing to let her settle into the comfort or fear of what she'd discovered. This wasn't over. It wasn't even close. By late morning, she found herself standing outside an old brick office building downtown, the kind that looked both forgotten and quietly important. Her heart pounded as she stepped inside, her stomach twisting with nerves she couldn't fully explain. What if the certificates were counterfeit? What if the lawyer didn't recognize her? What if this entire thing was a misunderstanding born of desperation? Part of her was terrified that walking through that door would shatter the fragile miracle she'd uncovered. Yet another part, the part her grandmother had nurtured silently, urged her forward. Not with confidence, but with necessity. She needed the truth. She needed answers. She needed to know what her grandmother had been preparing her for all these years. The waiting room was surprisingly warm, filled with old books, soft carpets, and sunlight that filtered through dusty blinds. It smelled like polished wood and something else Sarah couldn't quite place: stability, something she had never truly known. She sank into a chair, clutching the leather folio as if it were the last piece of a life she couldn't lose again. A stirred within her thoughts. Why would an attorney wait years for someone to arrive? And why her, when she had spent her entire life believing she was the least significant member of her family? Before she could spiral further, a soft voice called her name. An older man with silver-framed glasses and an expression of deep familiarity stepped into the room. It was strange. He looked at her as if he'd been expecting her not just for years, but for decades. Like greeting someone finally arriving after a long journey, right on time despite the delay. He invited her inside his office, and as the door closed behind them, Sarah felt the world narrow into a single moment, a single truth waiting to surface. She placed the folio on the desk with trembling hands. His reaction was immediate and startling, not surprise, not confusion, recognition, as if the folio belonged there, as if he had been waiting for it to return home. He opened the letter she handed him, her grandmother's letter, and read it with a softness that mirrored the emotion in Sarah's chest. When he finally looked up, his expression held an unspoken affirmation. Yes, everything she found was real. But then his next words unraveled her breath because they revealed that what she'd discovered was only the beginning. Her grandmother, he explained, had established a trust, a massive trust. One with clearly defined rules, timed releases, and contingencies. The stock certificates in the dresser were only the assets she wanted Sarah to find personally: tokens of memory, proof of intention, seeds of understanding. But the bulk of her investments, her accounts, her properties, and the structured financial portfolio she built after her husband's passing had been placed into a sealed fund. A fund that the attorney had been managing quietly, waiting for the day Sarah would come with the handwritten letter as confirmation. A second midhook punched into her thoughts as he unlocked a drawer in his desk and pulled out a thick, sealed envelope. It had her name on it. The seal was dated 13 years earlier. 13 years back when Sarah was still a teenager, still stumbling through grief, still unaware that her grandmother had been planning something extraordinary for her future. He slid the envelope across the table with a reverence usually reserved for sacred things. Inside, the documents detailed financial statements, property deeds, investment portfolios, and trusts that had matured far beyond anything her grandmother could have predicted. Numbers that didn't feel real, numbers that shouldn't exist for someone like her, someone who had been counting coins for bus fare just days earlier. When he revealed the total estimated value, Sarah didn't breathe for several seconds. The certificates she found were worth tens of millions, but the trust her grandmother had built, grown, and guarded in silence had ballooned to an amount so staggering it almost didn't make sense. Over $127 million. The number landed in her chest like a shockwave, hollowing out everything she thought she knew about wealth, life, and identity. Her mind raced with disbelief. She thought she'd already uncovered the truth hidden in the dresser. She thought the stocks were the miracle. But this was beyond a miracle. This was a destiny her grandmother had shaped long before Sarah understood her own worth. The attorney explained that he'd tried to contact her after her grandmother passed, but she'd moved so many times, changed numbers so frequently, that she'd become impossible to reach. And per her grandmother's instructions, he was forbidden from contacting any other family member. Everything depended on Sarah, on her actions, on her finding the hidden drawer when she was ready, not when the world thought she should be. It was too much, too big, too surreal. Her hands trembled as she held the documents, the room swimming around her. All her life she'd been fighting, scraping, surviving. Now she was being handed a future beyond imagining. But even as the attorney spoke, another realization crept through her like a shadow. A question that hovered at the edge of every revelation. How would her family react when they found out? The thought chilled her. Her family had never valued her when she had nothing. What would they do now that she had everything? Because wealth doesn't just change circumstances, it exposes people. And Sarah was about to learn exactly what $110 million did to the people she thought she knew best. There's an old saying that money doesn't change people, it simply reveals who they really are. Sarah had never paid much attention to that idea before. Money had always been a distant concept, something other people owned and discussed with casual ease while she juggled overdue notices and grocery budgets. But now, with a future reshaped by a number she still couldn't say out loud without her voice trembling, she was about to see just how accurate that saying really was. Leaving the attorney's office, she felt like she was walking through a dream she couldn't fully wake from. Everything around her looked sharper, louder, more in focus, yet none of it felt real. The envelope in her bag might as well have been made of fire for how conscious she was of its presence. The world wasn't different, but she was different, even if no one else knew it yet. And that quiet secrecy, the knowledge that she carried a truth large enough to reshape her entire life, was both exhilarating and terrifying. A curiosity hook tugged at her thoughts. What happens when someone who has always lived quietly suddenly becomes someone impossible to ignore? Her first instinct was not to celebrate, but to protect, to hold the truth close until she understood its weight. She needed space to breathe, to think, to believe. But life rarely offers pause when transformation arrives, and hers was no exception. Because the moment she arrived home, to the apartment she wouldn't need much longer, her phone lit up with messages from people who had barely noticed her before. Jessica wanted to drop by. Her mother wanted to talk about something important. Even Marcus, her ex-husband, who had once laughed at her for keeping the ugly dresser, had suddenly remembered she existed. She didn't know how they knew she'd been downtown. She didn't know which thread of information had unraveled. But somehow, word had spread that Sarah had visited an attorney. And in her family, an attorney only meant one thing: money. The first messages were subtle. The second round was less subtle. By evening, the calls became intrusive, insistent, demanding. It was as if the world sensed a shift in her energy and came rushing forward to claim pieces of it. Yet they still didn't know the truth, not even close. They were reacting to a whisper, not the storm itself. But it was enough for Sarah to understand something critical. The moment they discovered the full extent of what she now possessed, everything would change. And not necessarily for the better. A midhook pressed sharply in her mind. What would happen when the poorest member of the family suddenly held more wealth than all of them combined? The next day confirmed her fears. Jessica showed up at her apartment unannounced, the same disdainful expression she always wore when looking around Sarah's small, cluttered living space. But that disdain flickered when Jessica spotted the open folio on the counter. A hunger not for knowledge but for ownership flashed behind her eyes. She asked questions disguised as concern, but Sarah could read between the lines. Jessica didn't want to understand, she wanted to calculate. She wanted to measure how much of Sarah's windfall she could carve out for herself. Her mother's reaction was different but equally unsettling. She oscillated between guilt and entitlement, insisting that the family deserved to share in the inheritance, that her grandmother should have left instructions for everyone. Sarah saw something in her mother's eyes that made her stomach tighten, not love, not pride, but something much closer to resentment. By the time Marcus called, she already knew what he wanted. He launched into practice sympathy, reminiscing about their marriage, suggesting they had unfinished business. Sarah almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was so predictable. The man who mocked her, belittled her, dismissed her dreams, and sneered at her dresser was suddenly eager to reconnect. Wealth hadn't just shifted Sarah's circumstances, it had peeled back the thin veneer of civility people wore around her. She saw their intentions clearly now, each one magnified in ways she could no longer ignore, and it frightened her, not because she feared losing the money, but because she feared losing herself in the noise of other people's demands. Another midhook settled into her chest. How do you protect something you never expected to receive, especially when everyone around you suddenly believes it belongs to them? But something else began to shift, too, something unexpected, something good. Sarah found herself moving with a new kind of strength, a steadiness she hadn't felt in years. Pain and poverty had shaped her into someone resourceful, disciplined, and emotionally resilient. Now, wealth didn't weaken her, it revealed her backbone. For the first time in a long time, she didn't apologize for existing. She didn't shrink, she didn't explain, she simply set boundaries, clear ones, firm ones her grandmother would have been proud of. No, she wouldn't share the information until everything was legally finalized. No, she wouldn't loan money. No, she wouldn't revisit relationships that had already proved toxic. No, she wouldn't entertain guilt disguised as concern. She watched as people reacted to her boundaries, and their reactions revealed more truth than their words ever could. Some became aggressive, others tried manipulation. A few attempted emotional blackmail, but each attempt only strengthened her realization her grandmother had chosen correctly. No one else in the family had been ready to hold such responsibility. Only Sarah had lived enough of life stripped down to the bone to understand what truly mattered. Still, the noise grew overwhelming. The calls, the messages, the pressure. The sudden weight of being seen, not as a person, but as a resource pressed hard against her chest. She needed quiet, she needed clarity, she needed a moment to remember why this miracle had been entrusted to her. And that was when the unexpected happened. Someone reached out not for money, not for answers, not for a piece of her fortune, but with something else entirely, something Sarah hadn't felt in a long time. Something she wasn't sure she could trust, but couldn't ignore either. Because in the middle of the chaos, Sarah was about to uncover one final secret, one last message from her grandmother that would reveal the true meaning behind the dresser, the fortune, and the legacy she was meant to carry. The moment the world finally quieted enough for Sarah to hear it, the last thing her grandmother had prepared arrived not as money or property, but as a voice, recorded, deliberate, and softer than Sarah had expected, like sunlight through thin curtains, and it carried the final instruction that would shape how she used everything she'd been given. She had imagined that the climax of this ordeal would be a bank balance or a legal victory, a number that solved problems and erased scars. Instead, it was a letter and a video and a handful of carefully authored pages that explained why the dresser had been ugly, why it had been hidden in plain sight, and why her grandmother had asked fate to test Sarah rather than hand her the keys to wealth while she was still young. The recording began with a laugh that sounded exactly like the one Sarah remembered from childhood, then slid into sentences that had been written long before the fortune could be counted. That money, her grandmother said, does not create character any more than the weather creates a tree. It only helps the tree reveal where its roots already run. That line struck Sarah like a bell. Her grandmother explained that she had watched people around her change when convenience arrived, and she feared that if she gave everything away too early, Sarah would be wrapped in others' expectations and lose the quiet honesty that had kept her kind through years of being overlooked. The brief video was not a map to riches so much as a compass for living. Build slowly, guard your heart, learn how to say no, give only when it does no harm to your own life, and never allow money to replace the work of loving people with presents rather than checks. Each sentence landed with the gravity of someone who had lived long enough to see every possible outcome and decided that what mattered most was not the size of the inheritance, but how it would be used. As she listened, Sarah realized the dresser had been both vault and lesson, a test of patience and a study in trust, and that acceptance of the gift required her to become someone who could carry it without being carried by it. The immediate temptation was as human as breath: to buy things, to mend every wound in the family, to solve every debt and erase every humiliation in a single sweep. But the recording had taught her to resist the rush, to allow the blessing to shape her rather than letting it blunt her. She saw now that her grandmother had not been cruel by keeping secrets. She had been fiercely protective, refusing to let the family's greed or vanity define how the fortune was spent. That lesson steadied her more than any bank statement ever could. In the weeks that followed, Sarah did practical things with extraordinary care. She met with the financial advisor her grandmother had chosen and learned about trusts and stage distributions. She accepted the attorney's offer of an emergency release, but refused to broadcast the details. She bought a modest home with a backyard where morning light warmed a small studio that would become her painting room. She paid off the debts that had felt like constant, low-grade fires, and she established a foundation in Emma's and her grandmother's names specifically designed to help single parents with emergency housing and medical needs, a quiet vehicle for generosity that her grandmother's letter had insisted must include checks and coaching, not just cash, to prevent cycles of dependency. But the transformation that mattered most was invisible. Sarah kept her boundaries. When family members called, voices suddenly thick with entitlement, she listened with compassion but held her ground. She offered opportunities to apply for positions at the foundation and suggested community programs rather than handing out sums that would vanish into old patterns. When Jessica demanded a share because family should share, Sarah replied with the same calm her grandmother had used in the letter. She explained the trust structure, the stage distributions, and that the decision had always been Rose's to make. It was brutal and necessary, and it revealed who loved Sarah and who loved the idea of what she might provide. Even Kevin, the landlord's son who once smirked at the dresser, returned years later with an awkward apology, not because he'd suddenly become noble, but because the news of Sarah's steadiness had reached him and human decency had finally nudged him. She accepted the apology without reward, and when the moment felt right, offered him a small job at the foundation's logistics team. The gesture was neither charity nor punishment, but an invitation to be useful rather than perform penance. The public life that accompanied money never excited her. Instead, she focused on learning about impact, about governance, about how to turn generosity into systems that outlasted ego. That meant hiring people who knew how to run programs, insisting that evaluations and follow ups be mandatory, and refusing to fund projects that sounded good but had no measurable outcomes. She learned to sleep again, to paint in afternoons without guilt, to make coffee for a friend without calculating the cost. Those small, ordinary acts reclaimed the humanity her grandmother had feared losing. Yet the strongest part of the inheritance was not the financial freedom, but the permission to choose who she would be. Someone who could travel without a side of anxiety, who could fund the surgeries of people she loved, who could pay for scholarships and save neighborhood buildings from demolition, but who also had limits and a stubborn insistence that dignity cannot be bought. There were days when the weight of decisions felt crushing, when the calls and requests and offers threatened to turn her into a walking ledger. But every time she felt pulled toward exhaustion, she watched the video again and heard Rose's voice telling her not to confuse activity with meaning. That phrase became her guide. Years later, looking at a canvas where she had painted the dresser the color of sunrise, Sarah understood that the lesson was not about the object at all. The dresser was a spark, a story, a test, and the treasure inside was as much about resilience and trust as it was about transfer of wealth. She had been chosen not because she had suffered, but because she had shown, through ordinary acts of survival and small kindnesses, that she could steward something larger than herself. The money changed the logistics of her life, but did not remake her soul. Instead, it revealed the person she already was and amplified her choices. And in that amplification, she found a responsibility she welcomed. To ensure that other people's ugly dressers, those overlooked, derided pieces of life, might one day contain something that saved them too. Because sometimes the world tells us to throw things away, but when we refuse, we discover that what looks worthless may be the map to everything we truly need. There are chapters in life that don't announce themselves with fireworks or grand revelations. They arrive quietly, almost unnoticed, unfolding like the turning of a season. Months had passed since Sarah uncovered the fortune hidden in her grandmother's dresser, and yet she still felt as though she were stepping cautiously across a bridge, suspended between who she had been and who she was becoming. The world saw her differently now. Even strangers who learned her name through whispers treated her with an uncomfortable mix of awe and suspicion. But inside, Sarah still felt like the woman who once knelt beside that same dresser and prayed for a miracle to cover next month's rent. She resented the idea that wealth alone had transformed her. If anything, it had simply cleared the fog around her, revealing the landscape of her life with painful clarity. Her new home reflected that clarity. It wasn't extravagant, nor was it designed to impress anyone. It had soft lighting, sunlit spaces, and a quiet backyard with a small shed she'd converted into her painting studio. The first few mornings she woke there, she cried not from sadness but from the shock of peace. No eviction notices taped to doors, no shouting from neighboring apartments, no vibrating anxiety in her bones reminding her of overdue bills. Just calm, a kind of calm that felt foreign after a lifetime of scraping to survive. And yet, calm alone didn't rebuild a life. It simply gave her space to ask the questions she had never had time to ask. What do I want? Who do I want to be? What do I do with the weight of this legacy? That weight felt heavier than any number in her bank account. At the heart of it lay her grandmother's final message. Money was a tool, not a map. It could build, but it could also bury. It could heal, but it could enable wounds to deepen. Sarah took those warnings seriously. She refused to turn into someone who used wealth as a shortcut to identity, so she made decisions slowly, deliberately, sometimes painfully. She invested in therapy for the first time in her life, unpacking years of grief she had never allowed herself to fully feel, the grief of lost stability, lost relationships, lost versions of herself. It was strange to sit across from someone whose job it was to listen, to validate, to help her understand why she had clung to strength so tightly that it had nearly suffocated her. For the first time, Sarah learned that survival mode wasn't living, it was bracing, and she no longer needed to brace. The foundation she created in her grandmother's and Emma's names became her grounding purpose. She poured herself into learning the intricacies of nonprofit work, hiring people wiser than herself to structure programs that provided emergency housing, legal support, financial literacy coaching, and childcare assistance to single parents on the brink of collapse. She didn't throw money at problems, she built lifelines. She insisted on follow up checks, required budgeting mentorship for those receiving aid, and worked quietly behind the scenes to ensure the foundation stayed true to its mission. Helping people like the version of her who once stood on the edge of losing everything. But success brought shadows. Not everyone celebrated her efforts. Her family's resentment simmered beneath every interaction. Her mother accused her of being ungrateful. Jessica stitched together stories to justify why she should have been included in the inheritance. Marcus threatened legal action for assets acquired during marriage, even though they had divorced long before the fortune came into existence. Money hadn't changed Sarah, but it had unmasked everyone around her. Yet in the midst of those tensions, something unexpected bloomed, something she never anticipated: genuine connection. It began with a message from a man who had once been a regular at the diner where she worked. He wasn't reaching out for money. He was reaching out because he had seen the news about the foundation and wanted to volunteer. He remembered the days she served coffee with quiet resilience, never realizing how much she carried. Volunteering together turned into shared meals, then into conversations that stretched long into the night. He wasn't drawn to her wealth. He was drawn to her courage, and Sarah found comfort in someone who saw her without seeing dollar signs. She wasn't sure where it would lead, but the possibility didn't frighten her anymore. Still, the dresser remained the anchor to everything. She kept it not restored, not polished exactly as her grandmother had left it. It sat in the corner of her bedroom, a relic of survival and a symbol of destiny. Some nights she would run her fingers across its carved flowers, wondering how many secrets objects held long after the people behind them were gone. She considered moving the certificates into a safe, but some irrational part of her resisted. The dresser had protected those secrets for decades. It felt wrong to strip it of its purpose now. A midhook threaded into her mind. What else in her life had she dismissed as worthless, only to discover it held the seed of transformation? One evening, months into her new life, she received a package, no return address, no note except for a single line written on the back of the envelope. For when you're ready, inside was a second recording from her grandmother, apparently meant to be delivered after the estate transitioned fully into Sarah's control. With trembling fingers, she played it. Her grandmother's voice came through softer this time, older, as if recorded in a moment of reflection. She spoke about legacy, not the wealth, but the unseen legacy of knowing your own worth. She reminded Sarah that she had spent too much of her life apologizing for existing, for struggling, for needing help she never received. The fortune wasn't meant to erase the past, it was meant to rewrite how she valued herself. Love yourself enough to build a life that feels like yours, her grandmother said gently. Spend wisely, give generously, and keep your heart pointed toward the people who have none of your wealth but all of your courage. Those words settled into Sarah with a completeness she hadn't known she was missing. It wasn't the money that made her wealthy, it was the permission to finally grow into someone her grandmother always believed she could be. The dresser had not saved her life, her grandmother had. And Sarah realized that if she spent the rest of her life honoring that love, she would never feel lost again. Because sometimes the things we carry aren't burdens at all. Sometimes they are blueprints for the life we were always meant to build, waiting for the moment we finally learn how to open the drawer. Money has a way of stretching time differently. It lengthens some moments and shortens others. And long after the immediate shock of inheritance had faded, Sarah discovered that the real work began in the quieter years when expectations turned into obligations and generosity demanded structure. At first, the rhythm of her days felt blessedly ordinary. Mornings in the studio painting until light pulled the colors right, afternoons at foundation meetings where she learned the language of grant metrics and impact reports, evenings on the phone with program directors who warmed to the idea of dignity first aid. But soon she realized that giving was only the first step. Sustaining change required systems that could outlast her impulses. That insight led her to create a mentorship program, matching people who had climbed out of hardship with those still clawing their way up. It was simple in idea but devilishly difficult in practice, because the people who needed help most were also often the ones hurting most, mistrustful, exhausted, weary from being promised quick fixes many times before. A midhook formed as she watched the first cohort meet. Will training and empathy be enough to break cycles, or would money simply paper over deeper wounds? She refused to find out by accident, so she hired experts, set up evaluation teams, insisted on follow ups, and introduced small sum seed grants tied to accountability and education. That approach won praise in some circles and suspicion in others. Strangers hailed the program as thoughtful philanthropy, while cynics claimed she was controlling beneficiaries' lives. Sarah learned to listen without letting every criticism yank her off course. There was wisdom in accountability, she realized, and strength in humility. Meanwhile, her personal life threaded forward in unexpected ways. An art show curated by a local community center drew attention not for the polish of her canvases, but for the story behind them. The dresser painted in layers of pigment, each stroke an echo of past rooms and past storms. And the show sold out quietly to supporters who wanted to invest in the foundation rather than the woman. That afternoon, she walked home with a check large enough to fund a year's worth of emergency housing and a heart full of dissonant gratitude. She still recoiled sometimes when reporters reduced her life to a headline, but she no longer flinched when strangers thanked her for changing their neighborhood. Yet the ripples had other edges. An investigative reporter, hungry for drama, dug through public records and stumbled on a funding decision that had faltered, a small contract awarded to a nonprofit head who failed reporting standards. The story splashed across local feeds with misleading headlines, and for a week Sarah experienced the old sensation of exposure, the reflex to hide behind a stapled tooth smile and keep working. A midhook tightened. Would a rare misstep and the inevitable clickbait drown the slow, steady transformations her teams had been making? She answered by opening the books publicly, by inviting critics to town hall sessions, by showing the work behind the numbers rather than only the outcomes. Transparency calmed some storms, other waves continued. And family drama, which had simmered like a low flame, flared anew when Jessica launched a campaign of social pressure. Sudden Instagram posts about family rights and emotionally charged interviews with sympathetic hosts who framed Sarah as selfish for refusing to hand out checks without plans attached. That pain stung, the old ache for approval surfaced despite everything she'd learned. But Sarah found strength in the community that had grown around the foundation. Parents who'd kept their apartments because of emergency grants, volunteers who had found careers through her job training program, the young painters who used her studio and considered her an anchor rather than an icon. Their calls and letters were ballast. She started a monthly open studio where neighbors could paint, talk, and bring practical problems to staffers. No media allowed, just people hashing through budgets and childcare challenges over tea. Those rooms taught her something priceless. When wealth is wielded with borders, it becomes a bridge rather than a flood. Over time, her artistic practice evolved too. Canvases grew less autobiographical and more communal, large collaborative works created with beneficiaries that would later hang in community centers as reminders that people who suffered could also create beauty. A midhook emerged again as an old friend from the diner reached out with a problem he couldn't admit to anyone else. His brother's small auto shop was on the brink because a developer wanted to buy the block for luxury condos. Sarah used legal resources from the foundation to help him form a co-op, negotiated with the city to secure affordable commercial space, and watched the shop transform into a worker-owned business that kept wages steady and preserved a corner of the neighborhood's soul. It felt like a victory measured in human terms rather than balance sheets, but victory had its own double edge. Once you became known as someone who could save things, you became the default solution for every crisis. Exhaustion crept in the form of calendars filled with rescue requests and emotional pleas from strangers who believed Sarah should fix every wrong. She revisited the video from her grandmother on nights when the tide of demand felt like it might sweep her away, and the phrase, "don't confuse activity with meaning," acted like a lifeline, helping her decline certain projects without guilt. The foundation matured into an ecosystem: grants, training, public partnerships. But Sarah also ensured it had an exit strategy for projects that needed local ownership to survive. That willingness to step back, to let others lead, became part of her legacy. Years passed, there were celebrations, a community center ribbon cutting with neighbors who had once slept in cars, scholarship awards for young single parents who would be the first in their families to graduate college, murals that replaced boarded-up windows. There were quieter reckonings too: a former family member who publicly apologized, a succinct reconciliation lunch with her mother where some wounds were bandaged though not erased, and a weekend when Sarah returned to the apartment building where she had once lived to install a small plaque near the stairs commemorating renters who had endured the struggle. In the soft geometry of these moments, she understood something deeper than her grandmother's lesson. that wealth could amplify intention, but it could never substitute for the slow, stubborn labor of building trust. The dresser's presence in her bedroom remained unchanged. Sometimes visitors asked why she kept it, and she would smile and say, "It taught me how to wait." In that waiting, she found a legacy that didn't rest on numbers but on people who, given time and dignity, rebuilt their lives. And even when the foundation's work looked like small ripples, she knew the ocean it nudged had only just begun to move, because legacies are patient things, and they keep unfolding long after the headlines fade. Legacy is a strange thing, soft in its arrival, loud in its consequences, unpredictable in the way it echoes through the years long after the person who created it is gone. And Sarah found that even a decade after opening the hidden drawer that changed everything, she was still unraveling threads her grandmother had placed with deliberate, almost prophetic intention. At first, the fortune felt like a lightning strike, dazzling, disorienting, reshaping the landscape of her life overnight. But over time, wealth became less of a shock and more of a stewardship, something she tended like a long, delicate garden. She learned to anticipate seasons. The burst of demand after a foundation success story went viral, the droughts when criticism grew louder than praise, the storms when bureaucracy strangled progress and she had to fight to protect what mattered. What surprised her most wasn't the applause or the envy, it was the quiet transformation of her own heart. There were mornings when she woke up before sunrise, made coffee in her kitchen filled with quiet rather than panic, walked barefoot to her backyard studio, and realized she had finally arrived at a life that felt like breathing rather than bracing. Yet comfort, she learned, came with its own challenges. When nothing was threatening her survival anymore, she had to figure out what she truly wanted. A midhook formed as she realized that wanting was unfamiliar territory for someone who had spent most of her life simply needing. For years, she had poured herself into the foundation as if it were the only safe direction for her energy. And while she still loved the work, the programs, the people, the outcomes, she began to sense that something inside her was shifting. The foundation was no longer just a response to the past, it was becoming a ceiling for the future. The team didn't need her in the same way anymore. They were experienced, confident, capable of running operations without Sarah's constant presence. That truth frightened her more than any bank balance ever had. If she wasn't the struggling version of herself, and if she wasn't the savior version either, then who exactly was she supposed to be next? That question haunted her for months. She kept showing up to meetings, reading reports, shaking hands at fundraisers, but she knew she was lingering out of obligation, not purpose. The world saw her as a philanthropist, a miracle inheritor, a symbol of transformation. But Sarah knew symbols could become cages, and she refused to spend the rest of her life inside a cage, even a gilded one. One evening, while sorting old documents in her studio, she came across the dresser painting she had finished years ago, the sunrise-colored one that captured both the weight and warmth of her grandmother's gift. She stared at it for a long time, tracing the brush strokes with her eyes, noticing details she had forgotten adding. A thought surfaced so quietly she almost missed it. Maybe the foundation wasn't the end of the legacy. Maybe it was only the beginning. A midhook sharpened. What if her grandmother had intended not just to rescue her life, but to free her to imagine a world she had never had the luxury to dream about? The idea grew slowly, like dawn. Sarah realized she wanted to create something new, something not bound by emergency response or survival, but by creativity, community, and continuity. She began sketching ideas for an arts initiative, a network of community studios, free creative residencies for people recovering from hardship, mentorship programs for young artists who needed both emotional and financial support. She imagined spaces where people could paint, sculpt, write, or rebuild identities that trauma or poverty had fractured. She pitched the idea to the foundation board not as a pivot but as an expansion, and to her surprise, the board embraced it wholeheartedly. They helped her form a parallel nonprofit, one that would run alongside the original but be rooted in beauty rather than crisis. Slowly, she began stepping away from day-to-day operations at the main foundation, trusting the team she'd nurtured to lead without her shadow looming over every decision. As she transitioned into this new chapter, her personal life deepened in ways she hadn't expected. The man who had first volunteered at her foundation pieced his way into her life with a gentleness she didn't realize she needed. He didn't rush her, didn't push for labels, didn't drown her in questions about money. He simply walked alongside her, filling silence with companionship rather than expectation. Their relationship developed not like fire, but like a tide, steady, patient, unassuming until one day she realized it had reshaped her entire shoreline. But even love, she learned, had to be built slowly when the past had trained her to expect abandonment. What made this relationship different wasn't romance, it was safety. He didn't love who she had been or who she had become. He loved who she was becoming, the version still forming at the edges. A midhook tugged at her days. Was this what her grandmother had seen long before Sarah believed it possible, that healing required room not just for survival but for growth? With the new art initiative thriving, Sarah traveled for the first time not out of necessity but curiosity. She visited communities where artists reclaimed abandoned buildings, where murals replaced despair, where creativity became a language of resilience. She sat with women who had escaped abusive relationships, with teens who painted their fears onto canvases, with former inmates who sculpted futures from clay. She didn't walk in as a benefactor, but as a listener, and those conversations shaped her projects more deeply than any consultant ever could. Years into her new journey, she found herself back in the presence of the dresser, the old wood now slightly more worn, slightly more sacred. She realized it had stopped being a symbol of what she inherited and had become a symbol of what she had built. Her grandmother had given her a fortune, yes, but more importantly, she had given her a narrative to rewrite. And Sarah had rewritten it well. As she sat beside the dresser one quiet afternoon, she thought about all the lives that had shifted because she had kept the one object everyone mocked. People had stable jobs, homes, childcare, therapy, opportunities, safe spaces to heal. Communities had grown stronger. Art had bloomed where poverty once suffocated creativity, and Sarah finally understood. Keeping the dresser had never been about sentiment, it had been about surrendering to a destiny larger than she could imagine. Because legacies don't end when money is spent or programs succeed. They continue every time someone chooses courage over fear, creation over despair, and possibility over judgment. And Sarah's legacy was only just beginning to ripple outward into lives she hadn't even met yet.